The second industrial revolution tech bubble, the roaring 20s, dying growth of autumn. Once again, easy money, new technologies, and euphoria convinced people that the nation was in a new economy and this time was different, which hosts an era of irrational exuberance. With approximately 100 years passing since the last economic phase of autumn, the mistakes of the euphoric phase in the 1830s was not remembered in the 1920s. The last time, in the early 1800s, it was the first industrial revolution. This time, it was the second industrial revolution that gave way to exuberated ideologies of economic order due to technological and banking advances. Last time, coal and steam power was discovered and industrialized for an energy source. Pulling furnace, advanced ironworking, combined with machine tools gave way to the factory system, which started industrial labor for Americans. The industrialization encouraged migration from agrarian lifestyles to the newly formed urban communities with urbanizing lifestyles, while tenements were developed for migrating populations. In the early 20th century, petroleum and electricity was used for energy sources. The Bessemer process gave way to steelworking. An assembly line process revolutionized the factory system and encouraged migration to urban communities that was changing with the building of skyscrapers that boomed in the autumn phase. The railway and steam power revolutionized energy and transportation that connected resources and opened new markets that helped foster urban growth while increasing productivity. In the early 20th century, it was the internal combustion engine that gave way to airplanes and automobiles that revolutionized transportation, and the new energy consuming goods such as cars, refrigerators, and radios also opened new markets. The automobile revolutionized communities, creating suburban neighborhoods and new venues of lodging and entertainment. The mass production of newspapers was the main medium of social indoctrination in the previous economic phase of autumn. But in the 20th century, the indoctrination was multiplied by radios and movies. This period was growing the United States into the world's largest economy, giving people the sense that they had a resilient economy. The combination of these technologies from the second industrial revolution plus the social economic changes that accompanied the revolution combined with easy money helped entice an irrational exuberance phase that inflated assets speculatively to unsustainable heights, just as in the autumn phase in the 1820s and 1830s. The country just advanced with new technology in energy, transportation, communication, and adopted a Federal Reserve that gave people the idea that severe economic problems were a thing of the past. The government passed legislation that enabled high leveraging of asset class instruments. This set forward the possibility that a lot of money can be made off having very little to back it, just as in the 1830s the banks had overextended credit during speculation as credit on land went unchecked that helped fuel a stock market speculation bubble. During the irrational phase that climaxed in the 1920s, the public was also over-leveraged on credit and obtained a negative savings rate while consuming the new technological advanced goods and financial instruments that helped fuel a stock market speculation bubble. The euphoria of the roaring 20s will soon be over on October 28, 1929, also known as Black Monday, which started a decline in the market that by 1932 the stock market had lost 89% of its value, which was the first down wave in the corrective pattern that signaled that the United States economy entered into the second economic phase of winter, also known as the Great Depression. The winter of the Second Industrial Revolution, also known as the Great Depression. With each arrival of the economic phase of winter, the economy is required to go through a period of rebasing of the debt structure with the bankruptcy of banking intermediaries and corporations to release the access of the euphoric period which is necessary before the supercycle can move forwards. Part of this rebasing meant for the closing of many failed over-leveraged intermediaries, which unfortunately leads to the deflation of wealth that causes a negative wealth effect to transpire. The behavior of greed that created the asset bubbles and made the economy unstable is directly responsible for the great disparity of wealth that helped usher in the autumn phase and made it prosper. It's the same misguided behavior that helped perpetuate the winter phase. During the early 20th century economic phase of autumn, before the Great Depression, America had turned into an economy that became heavily reliant on consumerism. Capitalism is a system in which the owner of property controls the production and financial decisions. The heavy extension of credit in the Second Industrial Revolution autumn phase produced heavy consuming and producing cycles that helped the social economic order become consumer based. To keep the production and consuming cycles going, extending credit had to be increased for the demand to continue on a consuming population that is being consistently pushed closer to subsistence wage. Before the crash of 1929, banks had loaned out as much credit as possible to keep the boom going, mainly for cars. In 1919, Ford started to finance cars, and by 1926, 75% of all cars sold were sold on credit, which automobiles was at the center of the craze in the roaring 20s. As Americans' wealth poured into the new crazes of consumer products from refrigerators to radios, the liquidity dried up from the decreasing savings rate and the increasing overextended credit, which make no room for assets and demand to go but down, which helps perpetuate a deflationary spiral. With a deflationary spiral means businesses would have to lay off and or cut prices to keep the balance sheets afloat, which help perpetuate the deflationary cycle. If the disparity of wealth was not so great during deflationary phase, there would be more liquidity from the lower classes to ride out the winter season. But instead, the disparity of wealth left the bottom half of the wealth pyramid with no liquidity to slow down the deflationary spiral, but instead help perpetuate it. Therefore, the parasites that owns the means of production collectively wring out the bottom half and consequently kill the host in a consumer-based economy. And it is well known that most parasites that host dies perishes along with it. Many nations at the time were suffering economic woes. Therefore, country after country started to adhere to protectionist financial and trade policies. To counter the deflationary spiral, for the spring economic season can commence, consumers would have to have their credit and purchasing power restored to them, which is difficult to administer during a deflationary environment. Many was unemployed in combination with a contracting money supply perpetuated the deflationary spiral. The government took several actions to try to move the economy out of the depression of the 1930s and to try to prevent this social economic disaster from occurring again. Out of all the actions that were done, none were probably more important in trying to prevent the Great Depression from happening again than the Glass-Steagall Act, also known as the Banking Act of 1933. This act was put in place to prevent over-leveraging and speculation and to prevent bank runs in the future. Other legislation was designed to help the needy in times of desperation and to put people back to work. This deflation continued until America entered the Second World War, which gave birth to its new industry of greenfield investments through the creation of the military-industrial complex, and until the groundwork was laid for the Bretton Woods system that helped form a basin in the three-phase corrective wave, then started a new positively inflating uptrend, which leads to the economic phase of spring. 20th century spring, World War II production, the military-industrial complex, and the New World Economic Order. The economic phase of spring is a period where the monetary system has cleared out enough imbalances, which leaves room for a new monetary base combined with heavy spending used to advance the productive capability of industry, which creates a new industrial production frontier, normally war-based, that sustains economic growth. The collapse of America's financial sector created a new base for which a new monetary system could be in place. The Bretton Woods system, established in 1944 by the Allied nations, created an international monetary base of exchange rates. The architects of the Bretton Woods system proclaimed that the reason the Great Depression deepened so harshly was that there was not enough international cooperation in monetary exchanges, which caused a magnitude of nations to adhere to protectionist policies. The attempts in the 1930s was unsuccessful in restoring positive inflationary pressures and employment, but when America ramped up military production to join World War II, the deflationary spiral became an object of the past. When the United States entered World War II, many corporations had to ramp up production on assembly lines to pump out the newly high technical, industrial, military equipment. In the past, before the industrialization of military equipment, corporations that made military equipment did not have to specialize in making high-tech and expensive equipment without being able to convert that technology used in peacetime consumable products until the later end of the 19th century, when America started building its industrial navy. Since the increase in war spending was seen as a major factor in pulling the United States economy out of the Depression, it was feared that when the end of World War II arrived, that the nation's economy would turn back downwards into a depression caused by returning soldiers looking for work and from government cutting back off military production. The solution to the economic problem of declining production after the war leads to the birth of the military-industrial complex. The military-industrial complex is formed from the interconnected relationships between the Pentagon, the White House, and Congress, and the special interest groups and corporations. After the integration of the military-industrial complex, the same major corporations that were responsible for producing peacetime consumer goods became the same corporations that bid on government contracts for military production. This ensured economic growth in the military sector through investments in corporate America through an ensured flow of public revenue through government spending. America entered into the Cold War towards the end of World War II in the power struggle between the last two competing economic orders, in which having a link between special interests, the Pentagon, and the White House ensured the continuance of revenue into the military industry. The end of World War II was also followed by an housing boom caused by the social economic changes in America that populated suburbia. By the 1950s, automobile ownership was more common, and the development of tract houses made the cost of houses decline, which made life in suburbia attractive. The returning military personnel returning back from World War II also helped the housing boom. Also helping the housing boom at the time was a social economic phenomena which had started to occur, which is known as white flight. As African Americans migrated from the South to the North, Northeast, and Midwest states during prosperous times of the Second Industrial Revolution, they moved into urban community, while simultaneously European Americans moved into the suburbs to escape property devaluations, as they made a self-fulfilling prophecy. They devalued communities by mass selling of properties and closing businesses that drained the tax revenue and wealth out of the communities as they moved to suburbia. Also, as African Americans migrated north for the industrial jobs that were short of labor during the boom of autumn and spring phases, these jobs were instead given to the new flow of immigrants discriminately. This helped lead to the social climax of summer. As with the economic springs of before, the American economy fell victim to competitive accumulation once again. There is only so much liquidity and demand an economic structure can absorb on the supply side till a situation arrives where the best route of achieving higher rates of returns does not lie within increasing production, but with mergers and acquisitions, cost cutting, and or competitive inflation for the aggregate market of competitive accumulating entities. Pay no attention to the man behind the curtains, as the first path he chose to keep the economic spring inflation going was to create inflation by lowering the amount of gold that a gold note can be redeemed for over the years, which created negative inflationary pressures and global tensions. These actions lead the United States economy into the 20th century economic phase of summer, also known as stagflation. The 20th century economic phase of summer, also known as stagflation, and the 60s and 70s movements. Summer tends to be a period where competition heats up to the point where the social economic order reaches monetary and social constraints, trapping the social economic order into a period of consolidation, which is reflected in the stock market until the pressures are alleviated and the euphoria of the economic autumn can commence. Ever since the Allied nations agreed to the Bretton Woods system, the Federal Reserve has been lowering the amount that can be redeemed by a gold note until 1971. At this point, America totally abandoned the gold standard for the first time since the Revolutionary War. This leads to the delivery of the needed liquidity for the game of wealth to continue in this mode of competitive accumulation. The problem was that assets, commodities, and labor started to increase in cost relative to the price of the new unbacked Federal Reserve note. This created higher symptoms of inflation that further stagnated the markets and economy. There was a set of wars that started in the late 60s and progressed in oil-rich regions involving many heads of oil exporting giants. By the end of most of the major wars, the petrodollar world order was in play. The phrase petrodollar was coined in 1975 to illustrate the new global economic order that has replaced the Bretton Woods system. This world order demands that all nations' purchases and sales of all crude products be made with U.S. notes only. Over time, it forced other commodities to also become priced in U.S. notes for pricing stability. This opened up the possibility of exporting inflation at little cost, or, in other words, expanding the money supply as the man behind the curtain saw fit, and have the foreign holders of American debt deal with the symptoms of inflation first. This action gave the United States economy the needed liquidity to usher in the next phase. The petrodollar enabled the United States Federal Reserve to raise interest rates on treasuries to deal with inflation without the policymakers having to worry about the contraction of liquidity that would have come along with it. But due to many nations at the time expanding the U.S. holdings to purchase crude oil, the dollar kept its liquidity, and increasing interest rates encouraged dollar strength. The petrodollar was the main facet that pushed the United States out of the summer phase of stagflation, and not Reaganomics. During this time period, the need to expand the wealth base was not the only constraint on society's social economic evolution. Social constraints tend to lead up to a climax in the heat of summer, and historically were elevated before the economic phase of autumn. Last time, it was the workers' movement with other movements running parallel to it. During the 60s and 70s, it was the civil rights movement. In the first industrial revolution cycle, the propertied class implemented constant degrading working conditions in the new factory system that led to great inequalities that drove the nation into the progressive era. This time around, African Americans were put aside throughout the second industrial revolution. As the second industrial revolution grew from its roots, African Americans was discriminated upon in housing, employment, and social status as their newly formed communities became slums due to the lack of revenue exuberated by white flight and discrimination. As inequality have a rooted function in capitalism, mainly to keep wages depressed, the upheaval capitalism inequality creates in the social structure creates tensions that demand to be relieved, which this time around led to the civil rights movement. As with last time, the inequalities of capitalism led to the progressive era. The expansion of the money supply enabled the stock market averages to break out of its trading range that it was locked in since the late 60s. Americans had just found their new sense of rights and a new sense of strength in the dollar, which leads the social economic structure into the economic phase of autumn.